Welcome back to Spitballin Cards. In today's video, we're talking all about Paul Skenes and if an 11-year-old did pull a card or if a grown man posing as 11-year-old pulled that card. Culture collision, CT scanning, and every other sports card drama of the last week. We are saving a little bit for next episode, but we got a lot for this one. So, guys, what have you heard about culture collision? Ty, I think you were there, weren't you?
I was. Yeah, I went to culture collision. So it was overall, it's pretty good. I was there only Saturday. And Saturday, from what I heard, was by far the busiest day. But like majorly mixed reviews from people. Some dealers told me that they absolutely killed it at the show. Like I asked them like on Saturday, how's the show been? And one of the guys said to me, he's like, this is like one of the best shows we've ever set up at. He's like, we sold out of almost all of our inventory day one. I've been trying to buy more. He had like 4 of those, glass showcases, and like 1.5 of them were full. And he was like actively like asking people if he could buy. So I heard that. And then I heard other people say it was going okay. And a handful of people said they didn't really sell much at all. My observations from the show in terms of like what was there, it was kind of funny. There was like a window salesman. So culture collision, for those who don't know, is not just cards. In theory, you might have sneakers, you might have other collectibles, memorabilia. Last year, I bought my kids a couple of Transformers at the show. Like there's generally, it's mostly cards, but they do some other stuff. They have a DJ, they play basketball. They've kind of tried to make it into more of a overall collector experience, and sneaker world meets sports cards. But there was like a random window salesman. There were people selling candles. I was like, is this the Atlanta Home Expo or is this, like a sports card show? But I can't imagine those booths had any success at all. I don't really know how they wound up there.
Process is these guys are bringing their wives. I'm going to sell some candles.
Yeah. So I think part of that was nice for wives and girlfriends and others who came some of the booths. Like there was some
my wife totally would have been at the candle booth.
Yeah. Windows, maybe not so much, but
windows, no.
Mm-hmm. But, seasonality. So like what was at the show? There was a lot of football, a lot of basketball. Seemingly every single table had gold kabooms somehow, like the usual high end, right? So even though, the big difference when you go to a larger show and one that sort of advertises itself to draw in dealers from around the United States and elsewhere is people have to be able to justify spending the money to fly into a show like that and set up. And in order to do that, they typically have like 4-figure cards and up, a lot of really like high-end expensive stuff. Contrast that with going to like a local card show when you have something smaller and more community-based. You can find typically like a much wider array of things. Like people will set up, you'll see a lot more value bins. You'll see a lot more, low-end slabs in the, $20 to $100 range. And then there will still be high-end dealers. So this is sort of your typical, lot of high-end stuff. I call it like the Groundhog Day effect. You just go one booth to the next and all the cards seemingly seem the same, even though they're all supposed to be really rare. One thing that was really interesting, so it's one little anecdote. So I was doing 2 different videos while I was there. I honestly didn't really get much of a chance to like walk around and do the show and like look for stuff I wanted because I was recording content for work. I went straight to the back corner, and the first guy, as I was walking by almost to where I was trying to stop, flags me down, and he's like, "Hey, Teapot, what's up, man?" And he's like, "Look, all I do is F1." And I'm like looking at his booth. Yep, I see that. He's like, "All I do is F1, but man, you were like so spot on about Topps Dynasty and baseball and how cheap those cards are compared to F1." And it was eye-opening for him. Like he was looking at the prices of baseball RPAs, knowing, and he knows baseball, he like knowing who these top players are and going, you had Max Verstappen's like 1-of-1 dynasty card go for 170K and Shohei Ohtani's go for 25. Like there's a huge gap in those two things. So we were talking about that a little bit. I go to the next booth, the first one that I stopped at when I started recording content, and the guy has almost nothing but Topps Dynasty, and it's all like spread out. And he's like, I love Dynasty. He's like, I just go for what I love. He's like, I only set up at like 2 shows a year, but I collect this and I think it's undervalued. And he had all these Dynasty cards. The next booth that I go to, completely unaware that the guy 2 down from him, who he was, like he hadn't talked to him, also tons of Topps Dynasty and talking to me, not even knowing who I was, about how underrated and how undervalued he thinks Topps Dynasty was. So literally the first 3 booths, I have all these people saying like, I think Dynasty's on the up. I think whatever. It was a very interesting anecdote to see that. And I did see a fair amount of Dynasty set up at the show. at different dealer booths. So I know we've talked a lot about that, but overall, it seemed like the show was really busy on Saturday afternoon from my perspective. Some others said they didn't think so. I heard Sunday was a ghost town, that like 60% of the dealers didn't even come back on Sunday. They had a ton of empty booths. And then we ended up hosting a trade night at Cards HQ on Saturday night that was just completely packed. They had to like make people wait outside. We were at fire marshal capacity. I think people were there until midnight or later, like partying, opening boxes. We were kind of soft celebrating a 1-year opening of Cards HQ. That was a lot of fun. Just like completely packed. People just trading and buying sealed boxes and ripping things. And that was a lot of fun as well. So like the overall vibe from my perspective was very healthy. I've heard recent other shows did very well. I heard the last Dallas card show was really strong and like one of the best shows ever, according to many dealers that I talked to. So in terms of the overall like pulse on the hobby, seems very strong. I think the reason there wasn't a lot of baseball there this time is just like seasonality more than anything. Like this is kind of like the slow time of the year still for baseball cards, whereas like football is heading toward the Super Bowl, basketball's in full swing. So, and there was a decent amount of Pokemon at the show as well.
Phil, what'd you hear?
Yeah, so I went to a show myself, a little bit different of an experience, different vibe, so less of the high-end stuff. This is a local show, their monthly best flipping card show, and it seems like, I think this is actually backed by my friend Bowman, 1951 is the guy that runs the show. So this is a legit stat. Each of the last 3 shows, I believe at least, have broken attendance records. So over 800 through the door-ish, I think. Don't quote me on that, but this is a show with like 60, 70 dealers. It's not incredibly huge. A lot of sports. I used to actually set up at the show. I stopped about a year ago. And it's turned into, and I've only been to the show a couple times since, it's turned into like 40% Pokemon, 60% sports. And it used to be 90% sports. And a year before that, it was 100% sports. So it's interesting. And there's probably more demand right now for the TCG stuff, as you guys would probably expect. A lot of the folks in the comments too have probably seen that too. And I actually couldn't wait to give my money over to a dealer. I had no idea what this stuff cost. And usually if I end up paying too much on something, if it doesn't bug me right away, it will later that day. I'll go home, I'll check comps, and I'll be like, what did I just do? Even if I overpaid by like $5 or $10, like it really bothers me sometimes. This time, I don't even care. I don't know what the cards are worth. You said 45. If you said 125, I would have gave him the money, and I got a nice Snorlax for my daughter. But on the sports side of things, because this is a sports card podcast, yeah, I think actually now is right around the time where you start to see baseball heat up. So I did see quite a bit of baseball January through March. Like if I was a seller, I'd want to set up during those months to sell modern baseball. That is, but yeah, I mean, this show isn't quite indicative of probably the show experience across all different shows, because I know a lot of the ones around here aren't doing as well. But this one is absolutely rocking, and I think it's got to be a positive sign, even if it's not fully reflective of all of the shows in Massachusetts right now.
So is the hobby back? Did it ever leave?
There's always going to be people selling cards because there's more and more produced each year. So
is that all it is?
That's some of it, Scott. And some of it is also culture. It's like, I think now it's commonplace for folks to go to like 8 card shows a month and 1 trade night a month, where it used to be like, you'd hit up like 1 trade night, there wouldn't be trade nights, and maybe you'd go to a show 4 times a year. You'd save your budget for that. But one thing, and I'll probably edit this out, but I was actually a little bit mystified looking around, seeing all of the people trying to sell sports cards. It's a choice you're voluntarily selling sports cards. Why are you doing that? Why don't you just try to sell Pokemon? You'll make more money that way. But then I realized that sports cards aren't very liquid. And that's one of the reasons why these bear markets are so long, is because it takes a long time for people, and people have the emotional connection to it, right? It takes a long time for people to get through all of this inventory that they're trying to sell. So yes, there will be a long period of time, people trying and failing at selling sports cards at shows. Some of these guys are doing great, and some of these people are full-time dealers. They know what they're doing. They're really turning around their inventories. They have 5 to 10 key suppliers to restock their inventory, to get stuff at 70-80% of comps. But a lot of people really don't know what they're doing, and that's kind of where I was at a year ago, trying to sell sports cards and failing at that same show.
I will say, Pokemon's not always this hot, so be careful. Don't buy just because Phil's buying. Phil doesn't give himself enough credit on what he knows and researches. So just be careful, because there's always going to be a top. And so just be careful with that. All right, Jeff.
What, just real quick on what Phil said, just to kind of piggyback on something. One thing that I think makes a lot of sense, but also kind of drives me crazy when I go to sports cards is back to that Groundhog Day effect, because dealers who've been doing it a while know what kinds of cards are liquid and move at shows. And so that's why you see the same thing at one booth to the next booth to the next booth. It's like the same stuff. And half the time they're just like trading and selling to each other. And there's all these deals happening, B2B type stuff happening. When I go to shows, a lot of the things that are a little more quirky and eclectic and niche that I might be interested in, or players that aren't the top tier players, you just don't find it at like these bigger shows, because it's not what moves. Whereas at local shows, you might find that stuff, because people just sort of post up for $50 with a table and put out whatever they have. And maybe some of that is more quirky if they like to get into breaks, or they just have stuff from when they were kids or whatever. They buy collections on Facebook Marketplace. Very different dynamics. The dealers who figure it out the best and who I think have found a way to be the most successful are the ones who know what moves at shows, and they know what moves on Pristine Auction, and they know what moves on eBay, and they know what they should just sell to another dealer or to a repacker, and they like find the right channels for themselves. But as somebody who looks for more like off the beaten path stuff, I find a lot of times I do kind of strike out at shows, and the people that I hear lamenting not having had success at shows are the people who put that kind of stuff out, because it's just like, I think it's just not what the collective mass herd is looking for.
Yeah. One last thing before we turn it over to Jeff. One of the things that really bothered me when I was starting to struggle selling sports cards at shows was I noticed the typical customer at a show is a reseller for sports often, right? It's not always a collector. So that's the issue. So the B2B versus B2C with sports cards right now, 70 to 80% of the time, probably just making up numbers, you're selling to another business, if not a reseller or an amateur business that is just looking to get something for cheap so they can just move out of it as soon as possible, which is fine, right? That they're providing liquidity, whatever. But with Pokemon, and it's changing because opportunists and charlatans like me are coming in. You're often selling to a collector. You're more likely to sell to a collector, and they're going to be a little bit less price sensitive. Like me, for instance, I just talked about that firsthand. And as Scott said, things move in cycles. Won't always be like that, but Pokemon's doing a lot of stuff to appeal to the collector, and Fanatics is doing a lot of stuff to lace their wallets with cash. Two different models, making unique, affordable cards that are in demand versus the whole lottery ticket mentality, in which we've already talked about that ad nauseum. We could again if we wanted to, but some of my thoughts. And these are like generalizations. I'm not saying that sports cards are dead. I'm not saying that your experience will be like this or that 100% of people are like this. Just kind of talking about like comparing and contrasting some of the stuff that I've seen.
I'm actually out on Pokemon. I sold all my cards to some sucker online. So maybe in the bottom right corner of the screen. Now I'm making a run at a card, so I'm selling some of my Pokemon that I have. So anyways, Jeff.
Oh, just one more thing. No, just kidding.
It's been 15 minutes. You haven't said one word.
All right.
Welcome back, Jeff. Hasn't been here for a week. We don't let you talk.
Salt to wake myself up here. The more important thing, Scott, is your mom out on Pokemon, because she seems to be the barometer of the collecting. So if she's not out, then all right, still good.
Yeah, we're good.
Just a few responses to the guys. I had heard also that especially the TCG Pokemon tables were doing really well at these bigger shows. And I'm wondering, will there be some sort of tipping point? It's probably more the bigger shows than the local shows, but how many Pokemon dealers can a show sustain? Like, will there be some I guess a tipping point. At what point is there too many? Will there be too many Pokemon collectors there? Will it scare away some of the sports card collectors? Will the tables not be able to do as well? I guess that's just sort of a market issue that'll correct itself if it happens. Ty, you talked a lot about Dynasty at the show. Were there people talking about what's going on with the 2024 Dynasty? Does anybody know about it? Are they hearing anything? Are they hearing anything as it relates to CT scan prevention or anything?
I haven't heard anything about that. No.
Are they worried it might not come out? Any of those Dynasty fans? Or are
I
they
haven't heard that at all.
I haven't heard that yet. I would
No.
Topps. The thing is, I don't think Topps is going to retire any of those very high ROI sets for them. It does not cost them very much money to make those cards. They were selling Dynasty for $350 like 4 years ago. So they'll release Dynasty.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe the delay might be trying to figure out a way to counteract some of the negatives.
I think the delay has nothing to do with that. I think the delay is entirely around trying to sell Definitive and trying to sell Transcendent. So they aren't going to announce Dynasty till they're sold, like everything's moved, and then they can move to the next tie-in. That's kind of my thought process.
Interesting. Well, the only thing I have to offer on the show end is that the Burbank show, which is now retitled the West Coast Card Show, I believe is the official title, is coming up in a couple weeks. So I'm really excited to go there, and especially after hearing about the success of the Dallas show and Culture Collision, I'm really excited to see what that entails.
When is that, Jeff?
It's Valentine's Day weekend, of course. So
I might be down there.
All right.
LA.
Well, it sounds like that'd be a good Valentine option. Bring your date to the show.
Nothing more that Kaylin would love than going to a baseball card show.
Yeah, and I don't think they're going to have candle dealers at this one, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I did have one question for you, Ty. So I went to the National the last 2 years. Growing up where I did in Idaho, we didn't have very many shows. I doubt they still do, unless you drive to Salt Lake or Boise. But with that being said, the National was tough to find cards of players who weren't like mainstream, but there were a lot of places with like dollar boxes. That was like the whole booth was $1 to $10 cards that were sort of by team. People would sit there for hours and go through them. So is the National way better than Culture Collision and those type of shows for player collectors?
Yeah. I mean, at the National, I wouldn't say you can find anything you want, but they definitely have those big booths that, like you said, are just value bins. That's what people bring. They just drive those big, I don't know what, shipping containers in with these value bins, and they put them out, and people that just sit there all day and flip through them. You just don't get as much of that at Culture Collision. I did one of the videos I was doing was a collab with another YouTube content creator, Trike Sports Cards, and we were doing like $100 spending challenge. And so I'm looking for value bins. I finally found a couple dealers, coincidentally, who were real close to each other with some good options, but most of it, like I said, was showcases out with, higher end stuff and nice stuff. But there was a lot of Brave stuff, obviously, too. But that was the majority of the baseball I saw.
Cool. All right. Well, that wraps it up for our first topic. Next topic, and we'll lead with you, Jeff. I want you to bat lead off on this one after only getting 10% of the time so far. But Paul Skenes, he is in your backyard. Well, that's not true. The card was pulled in your backyard by a 11-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. And this card is the rookie debut patch autograph, and it was just graded by PSA as a 10/10. Supposedly, from what I've read online, it was known to Topps on the 3rd of January. And then we didn't hear about it for quite a while after. So what are your thoughts on this Paul Skenes? Is there a conspiracy? Was it actually a kid that pulled it? What else could we tee up here? And do you think Topps has the obligation to collectors to let them know before like the 20th or so that this card was pulled, where people were buying the wax from the 3rd to the 20th trying to pull the card that was already pulled? What do you think?
A lot of things to cover there, and a lot of conspiracy theories abound. I think the situation was made more complicated by the issues that Southern California was facing with the wildfires, and apparently this family had to be evacuated twice, and there's a lot going on there. I guess my biggest takeaway from this whole thing is a discussion needs to be had about what is Topps obligated to reveal to their customers. It's not a regulated form of gambling like the lottery is, say. where they have to tell people when large hits are made. Going back to when the product was released, we frequently saw when these big hits were pulled, like Ellie was pulled, the redemption. So I don't know. The reason that we got a delay in this one, or the reason that maybe we actually found out, was because it finally went through the PSA process, so people were going to know because they'd show up on the PSA report, right? So that could have been the only reason that Topps came out with it. So what role does the individual who pulls the card have? Can they request secrecy so that people don't know that the card is pulled? Is there some sort of obligation that they have to make it public? Or can they ask the companies like Fanatics and Topps to keep it private, and then the obligations on them? There's a lot of those are the questions that interest me. I'm not really sure about the whole the journal entries and the time when the social media accounts at Topps knew versus the people who were actually dispersing the card. Because they're redemptions, there's a very specific fact that Topps knows when a card is pulled, which historically hasn't been the case. If you pull a big card, nobody's going to know unless you put it on your Instagram or you put it on social media. But because they are redemptions, the company does know. So that leaves you to wonder what sort of, as we said, obligation they have. The other concern I have is I know that Topps sold out of all of their product as it was going for multiple times what they originally were selling for. So I don't have a problem with that. I don't think Topps is waiting to sell it off their shelves. But because Fanatics now has such a vertical integration in the through the whole entire process, they have Fanatics Live, which does a lot of breaking. So there's a lot of breakers on there that obviously Fanatics is getting a cut of, so they want those breaks to be filled. So yeah, do they have an incentive to keep a card like the Skenes hidden? The fact that it was pulled, keep it hidden. And probably they do. They probably have a business interest there, but they are a business at the end of the day.
My thought process, you asked a question about like what obligation does the person who pulled it have to share? I don't think there's any. I don't think they owe anybody anything. I'm pulling that card. I don't think there's any issue that a dad doesn't want his kid's identity to be known that pulled this card, doesn't want to share them on social media. I have no issue with that. The conspiracy theories are essentially based off of the fact that the journal entry was weird to some people and the timing and everything. But if an 11-year-old did pull it, like if I had an 11-year-old, I wouldn't want to let people know I just pulled a multi-million-dollar. Like, I don't know how much it's worth. We don't know until it's auctioned, but I have no issues with that personally. But I know I'm probably the minority online. So I don't know. Phil, what do you think?
I think one of the things that came out was there was a marketing campaign that was pushed by Topps on like January 4th. It's a day after Fanatics had knowledge that the hit was in the 11-year-old's hands or whatever. So I do think Fanatics is a pretty large organization.
That's my
and
thought.
We have a work from home culture and the workforce is dispersed. Do you really think like an email went out notifying everybody in the organization that the Skenes was pulled? Topps and Fanatics are still not completely, well, they're probably integrated, but there's probably some things going on there where they're not doing a great job communicating with one another. I know it happens within my organization. Microsoft Teams is only so effective. I think this is and I'll drag Fanatics whenever I get the chance, and I'll say they're doing great things when I believe they're doing great things too. But I think in this case, this is just an area where they're going to learn, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of these are unwritten rules. If you look at like the sports card market 20 years ago, nothing like this would even be possible. We wouldn't know the Ellie was pulled. But now that social media is where everybody's sharing all of their hits, now that we've got, data about pop reports and people reporting that data quickly, I think things have shifted a little bit in that where before you're not expected to know which hits are pulled. Now, maybe the expectations are changed. And yes, there is an ethical dilemma, especially with Fanatics having that entire control of the entire process. We could talk about Golden too. Maybe that's what we'll talk about next. But I mean, I do believe the card was pulled by an 11-year-old. I do believe it was a Christmas gift because there'd be no other time of year where the father would be able to afford probably a $400 hobby box at the time for his kid, which is unfortunate, but it's just a reality of the situation. And I'm not sure if Fanatics had the intent of let's juice up Fanatics Live revenues and keep this under wraps for as long as possible. I think it was just them trying to figure out what can we do with this. And it sucks, but it is what it is. So sorry for taking off the tinfoil hat.
I'm in the same boat as you, Phil. I've worked in marketing before. A lot of times you're working on marketing campaigns. It goes through approvals, but it doesn't always go to like senior leader level like approvals. It's usually just the VP of marketing. So if that person didn't know, then I don't really think there was any wrongdoing from anyone there. It's easier to be angry, but realistically, I'm on the same page as you.
One quick thing I want to add to that. We've talked a lot about the verbiage that Topps puts on the back of their cards, that it's not from any specific game, player, or event. I know marketing is also very careful with wording, and I think the marketing release that Phil was talking about that went out was talking about the amount of the Topps debut patches that had been publicly revealed, or something of that nature. So there wasn't anything about it being pulled or redeemed. It was talking about publicly, because in truth, there could be 20 more of these that have been opened that we just don't know about. There might be people that put it in their collection that actually don't put it on social media, believe it or not. So I know that they probably put that in there as just a sort of caution.
If that's the case, some of those people may never want to grade it, so we'll never see them again. So.
Yeah.
But this isn't the first time. So it's interesting. The first 1 of 1 in baseball came out in 1997. It was Flair Showcase, had the 3 levels, row 0, 1, and 2. And they set up a hotline number for card shops to call when these 1 of 1s were pulled. So even back then, they were doing their best to keep track of these things, which is admirable and kind of cool. Obviously, sometimes it's just impossible. So, Ty, do you have any thoughts?
No, that transparency piece is interesting. I mean, I don't think they're under any obligation. I was trying to remember. I think there's a Twitter account tracking these things. Are you guys aware of that? So, I mean, there's at least some way to have an idea of that. But the way the pack outs happen and the way the boxes are distributed, they're not, under any obligation to disclose any of that. It is interesting if you compare sealed product to like a repack, and people have asked in the past, what kind of obligation is there if you have a repack to let people know that the chase has been hit in the repack? If I'm talking about cards, that if you don't sell out right away, if you have them in your store and you do your own repack and somebody rips one open and goes, oh my gosh, I got the J-Rod like Grail, and then do you tell the rest of the people coming in? Do you have an obligation? The big like digital repack ripper, sites like Arena Club and Courtyard and some of the others, they like automatically insert a new Grail chase when one gets hit. So like, so you always know, there's no like confusion about whether or not the big hit has or hasn't been hit. It just always calculates new odds and of hitting those particular Grails, and how they sort of actuarially balance that out. But so there's some interesting aspects to that legally. I'm not a lawyer. I'd be curious to know what somebody who's got a little more expertise in that space would have to say, and if there would be any grounds for like trying to figure out, were they holding it back? But overall, I just kind of am under the impression, we just saw the financial reports come out for Fanatics, and they obviously had a really strong year in the collectibles space. I don't personally believe they would stake their company's reputation and risk anything with lawsuits or fraud or anything like that over something like this to just do something funky. That's my personal opinion on it.
I think the optics here, the fact that the box was selling for, the hobby boxes were selling for about 4 times pre-sale and about 3 times release day pricing, and it's just been a short 2.5 months since the product came out. I think that makes things look bad. That's why people are questioning this, right? And unfortunately, people in January were spending $600 opening hobby boxes, which isn't smart, but it's a reality of the matter. People were trying to chase that Skene, so it's definitely unfortunate for sure.
This
and
is
it also
box
it
prices,
also
by
makes
the
me
way.
wonder. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to show like the dip over the last. Is that when we found out it was hit?
Yeah,
I'm assuming.
Yeah,
so
prices came down a bit,
Yeah.
and where are they at now? Like $425 for hobby,
something like that.
From jumbo, I think there was one sitting on eBay at about $850 bin. I think that's what Neo said. Where before The most recent sold was over 1,000, about 1,100 or something. So
Hmm.
This is where, and I know we're not taking the conversation here, but I was arguing with Chris a little bit on this one. This is when, if I can get a 40% discount on these boxes, this is now a scarce item, because if you look at the number of one-of-ones that are out there, it's about 75%. So we can assume roughly 25% is left. So although I wasn't a huge fan of like the $250, $300 initial price point of like release week, now if I can get these for $350, knowing that all of this has been opened and there's still a few debut patches left, like Yamamoto, like Jackson Merrill, and a few others. I mean, that Paul Skenes bounty, because it was so hard to hit, I didn't put that much perceived value on the box to open it. So when we were talking before, like, should we open? Of course you don't open these. You sell it all, or sell half now and sell the rest later. Well, the right call would have been to sell all of it, obviously, but I don't know. Not
now
giving
buy it back at some point.
Yeah, it's still not a good idea to open these. But if you want to buy maybe one of them to store for a little bit, who knows? Maybe the prices snap back up a little bit. People are freaking out. So be greedy when others are fearful, I guess.
All right. Well, that brings us to one more topic I want to bring up. And that is in regards to Fanatics Repacks. There's been a rumor, Neo talked about this, but Fanatics potentially buying back cards, repack, and making a repack for themselves, and then they sell to consumers. Which, first thought, aren't all Fanatics cards kind of not repacks, but they're basically already doing that because they're producing it and then selling it, and then they buy the cards back and then resell the cards and then buy the cards back. It seems like a very interesting cycle. How do we feel, one, about Fanatics repacks, and two, what are the consequences? Jeff, I'll start with you again.
Well, more, I think Phil touched a little bit earlier on some maybe ethical concerns, and that might be seen there as well. I think we're also missing the piece where they can, I think when Neo was talking about it, wasn't it like that they could be opened and then somehow like you don't even get them in your hand, right? So you can open them on Fanatics Collect, for instance, and then be selling them right back there. So you might never even get them in your hand, and then they go right back to Fanatics. And I mean, from a business standpoint, it seems like a smart move because there's a lot of money in repacks, right? And even when we're looking at the secondary market price that we were just talking about in the last topic about for the Topps Chrome update and the Paul Skenes, Topps and Fanatics aren't getting the benefit of those secondary prices. So this is a way that after their initial sales, whatever they sell the prices, whatever they sell the cards to the distributor, or in some cases on their website, right to the consumer, this is another way for them to get income on those cards further once they've already been out in the marketplace. So from a business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. But I think there's going to be a lot of people thinking there might be a conflict of interest.
I think there's a conflict of interest. Phil, what do you think?
Oh yeah, there's a number of conflicts of interest. There's another one every month. The more they expand, the more they get bigger. It makes me like they really need to get audited by a third party once a year. And I know Ruben did something like that when he took over the company. He's like, I'm not doing this because I need to. I just want to do it to prove to people that like we're not. And I think a lot of that had to do with loaded cases, loaded breaks. I don't know if they released all of the findings from that. But here's the thing: when you hire your own third party to do the audit, you get to relay what you want to disclose, of the findings, and it could be a little bit biased. Super microcomputers. There was a company that did this in the AI space, and they told them, no, you guys didn't do any fraud, and their stock price went up. So not to go down that rabbit hole there, but it's like this doesn't actually matter. Like this is actually really, really bad. There's still red flags here, but eventually, when they become public, when maybe more some regulation comes into the space, which you'd think it would have to at some point. There was a post floating around on the ether last week about a guy who had lost $244,000 on breaks last year. How many more of those stories are going to have to hit the Twitter space, X space, or like real newspaper articles? Like there are people here losing a lot of money.
It hit the Dave Ramsey show this week. Did you see that clip with the
That
Pokemon
is true. That was Pokemon cards. Yeah.
You tried to go on Whatnot and become a seller. So you like paid a bunch to get fake bots and bought inventory, and then it blew up, and like people are losing their livelihood and families. I know it sounds dramatic, but They got to be. I don't know. I think Fanatics getting mixed in this. I don't think it looks good for them. I think it looks bad.
Well, I think it is, like to Phil's point, I think it is going to really get the attention of regulators. And that goes back to our last topic too, about the transparency when you're having these hits that are hundreds of thousands of dollars as well. And the company might know about them or might not know about them. Those are the kind of things that regulators are going to look at and say, hey, this is like a state lottery. We've got to go in and make sure that it is audited by a third party. And I'm not sure if Fanatics really wants that. So I think they would be inviting that by going this repack route.
I don't have much more to add to that than what you guys said. Like, it's interesting. The bigger thing I think is just like regulation has to be coming at some point sooner or later. Like, there's so much stuff going on. You see these big numbers, and you got, Ken Golden throwing it out there about, they manufacture the cards and then they have private access to the cards and then they sell the cards. And now we saw the announcement that Fanatics is going to be doing their own digital repacks. And so they're, we're probably all just screwed, honestly, at the end of the day. But
just keep buying older stuff. Buy players you like. That's what's fun. Buy Pokemon, right, Phil?
Yeah. When Ken Golden is complaining about
Fairness,
how the rules aren't fair in the space, and not that he's like outwardly complaining about greed, but I mean, his business model, probably given what we know now, isn't as profitable as what Fanatics business model
can we
is.
say if Ken was involved in what's going on, you think he'd really be complaining about how unfair it is?
I think he's complaining about how unfair it is to him.
Every post has some sort of angle. He's a smart businessman, and it's worked for him. And for the record, the guy that lost $244,000, he actually spent $244,000 in 1 year on breaks. Said that not even the luckiest guy in the world would be able to get 20% of that back. So he lost $200,000 in a year. The Pokemon thing was $26,000 in debt. So it's funny how you can scale it accordingly. Like I'm not opening Pokemon cards because I like them more than baseball cards. It's because it feels like I'm not being completely taken advantage of.
Yeah, and you have a daughter. Your daughter likes it, which helps.
It confuses me. And again, everybody's in a different financial situation. There's a lot of whales out there that make a hell of a lot more than I do. But I just don't see how a vast majority of the hobby is able to do this. And I know they're not. It's not everybody, right? It's not everybody. And some people are living within their means. So,
well, thanks for watching, everybody. We appreciate you. We'll have 2 more videos out this week, and we'll see you in the next one.